Everyone knows the Vikings beat Columbus to America by 500 years. It's a fact that completely rewrites the story of discovery, a testament to their insane skill as navigators and their sheer, stubborn courage. They crossed the terrifying North Atlantic in open longships, dodging icebergs and lethal storms, to set foot on a new continental world of unbelievable promise. But if they were such fearsome warriors and legendary explorers, why did they walk away from their newfound land, and, for the most part, never return? Why didn't the Viking Age spark an American age? The truth is way more complex and surprising than you might think. This isn't a story of a single dramatic failure. It's a story of a dream that quietly unraveled, thread by thread, until nothing was left but ghost settlements and stories that would be shrugged off as myths for 1,000 years. To understand why they left, we have to follow their journey, from the promise of a new world to the harsh reality that ultimately pushed them out. Our story starts not in America, but on the very edge of the known Viking world. By the late 10th century, the Norse had pushed the boundaries of exploration further than anyone. They were masters of the sea, their ambition as wide as the ocean itself. This relentless drive took them first to Iceland, and then even further west to a huge, icy wilderness that a charismatic and famously hot-tempered outlaw named Eric the Red brilliantly marketed as Greenland. He figured correctly that people would be much more tempted to go there if it had an attractive name. And it worked. A small, tough-as-nails colony took root on Greenland's southwestern coast, a society of farmers and hunters living on the fringe of existence. It was from this remote outpost that the next, most audacious leap would be made. The Icelandic sagas, part history, part epic literature, tell us about Eric the Red's own son, Leif Erikson. Around the year 1000, hearing tales of a land spotted even further west by a sailor blown off course, Leif gathered a crew and pointed his ship toward the unknown horizon. What he and the explorers after him found was a world beyond their wildest dreams. The sagas, especially the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, describe a series of new lands. First was Helluland, a land of flat stones, likely Baffin Island. Next came Markland, a land of forests, probably the coast of Labrador, a gold mine of a resource for a Greenland colony starved for timber. But it was the third land that was the real prize, Vinland. The sagas paint a picture of a paradise, a place with a mild climate, lush pastures for cattle, rivers overflowing with salmon bigger than any they'd ever seen, and most famously, wild grapes growing everywhere, which gave it the name, Vinland, the land of wine. For people from the harsh, windswept landscapes of Greenland and Iceland, this must have felt like a gift from the gods. One explorer, Thorfinn Karlsefni, was so impressed, he led a bigger expedition of about 140 men and women, bringing livestock with the full intention of building a new life there. They had found a continent overflowing with resources, a place to build a future. So what went wrong? Why would they ever leave? The first clue lies buried in the soil of Newfoundland. For centuries, these Vinland sagas were the only proof of this North American adventure. Many historians just wrote them off as heroic fiction. The idea of Vikings in America was a romantic folktale, not real history. That all changed in 1960. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, a Norwegian husband and wife team, Helge and Anne Stein Ingsted, followed the clues in the sagas and made a discovery that sent shockwaves through archaeology. There, at a place called Lelnzau Meadows, they dug up the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. They found longhouse foundations, a forge for working iron, and artifacts like a bronze cloak pin and a soapstone spindle whorl, all identical to finds at Viking sites in Greenland and Iceland. This was it. Hard, physical proof. For decades, we knew they were here, but the exact timing was still a bit of a guess. Then, in 2021, a game-changing study in the journal Nature gave us an exact date. Scientists analyzed wood cut by the Vikings, identifiable because they used metal tools, which the local indigenous people didn't have. They pinpointed a massive solar storm that left a distinct radioactive signature in tree rings. Worldwide, in the year 993 AD, in the Viking cut signature in the Viking cut wood, and then counting the rings to the edge. They figured out with stunning precision that the trees were cut in the year 1021 AD, exactly 1,000 years before the study was. But this incredible discovery also revealed something crucial. L'Anse Meadows wasn't a sprawling colony. It was small, likely housing fewer than 100 people. It looked more like a base camp, a home base for the winter, and a jumping-off point for expeditions further south. The discovery of butternuts at the site, a type of nut that doesn't grow in Newfoundland, proves the Vikings did travel further south, into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, closer to the Vinland described in the sagas. The site was probably only used on and off for a decade or two, not for generations. This wasn't a settlement built to last. It was a foothold. And it was a foothold they were about to lose, because they soon found out this new world wasn't new at all. It was already home. The Vikings had one huge advantage when they settled Iceland. Nobody was there. In Greenland, they found a vast, empty landscape. But Vinland was different. It was already home to numerous indigenous peoples, groups the Norse came to call the Skrælings. That name itself is revealing. In Old Norse, the term's exact meaning is debated by scholars, but it can be interpreted as shouters or screamers. It was not a term of endearment, and its modern Icelandic descendant can mean foreigner or barbarian. Whatever its precise origin, the name points to a relationship that was headed for trouble from the start. The sagas are brutally clear about what happened next. At first, there was curiosity. The Skrælings, likely ancestors of the Mi'kmaq or Beothuk peoples, were fascinated by the Norse, their ships, their livestock, and their metal tools. The Norse, in turn, wanted to trade for valuable furs. One saga describes early encounters where they traded red cloth for pelts. But these peaceful moments didn't last, shattered by cultural misunderstandings and outright violence. One saga tells of a disastrous meeting that started when a Norse bull broke free and charged at the Skrælings. Having never seen such an animal, they panicked and fled, thinking it was an attack. They later returned in greater numbers, armed and ready for a fight. A battle broke out. The Vikings, with their iron swords and armor, had better weapons, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Another story tells of Leif Erikson's brother, Thorvald. He and his men captured and killed 8 natives. In retaliation, a swarm of canoes surrounded their ship, unleashing a storm of arrows. Thorvald was hit under the arm. As he lay dying, he basically prophesied their failure. "This is a rich land," he said, "but we will have little peace from those who live here." The sagas state that despite the land's bounty, the Vikings knew they would face constant war and terror from the native population. One of the most vivid accounts features Freydis Eric's daughter, Eric the Red's ferocious daughter. Seeing the Norsemen retreat during a battle, she supposedly grabbed a sword, tore open her dress, and beat her bare chest with the flat of the blade while screaming in defiance. This shocking display was said to have stunned the Skrælings into a temporary retreat. But one act of ferocity couldn't change the basic math. The Vikings were a handful of families on the edge of a vast, populated continent. They had come for resources, but they found a constant, draining, and bloody guerrilla war they simply could not win. This was the first, and maybe the most important, reason they left. They weren't driven out in one epic battle. They just decided that the price of Vinland, paid in blood, was too high. The story of the Vikings in America is packed with these incredible moments of discovery and conflict. A history that was almost lost to time. If you're finding this dive into a forgotten chapter of history as fascinating as I do, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We have so many more mysteries from the past to uncover together. Even if the Vikings had somehow made lasting peace with the indigenous peoples, they faced another enemy, one they could never defeat: geography. Their American settlement wasn't a colony like the later British or Spanish empires. Those were state-sponsored projects, backed by the full power of a kingdom's money and people. The Viking trips to Vinland were basically private family ventures, organized and paid for by a few people from a tiny remote colony on the edge of the world. Think about the journey. The distance from their main base in Greenland to Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland was over 2,500 kilometers, or 1,500 miles. This was a treacherous piece of the North Atlantic, an ocean of icebergs and violent storms. To sail from their original home in Norway to Vinland was a trip of nearly 4,000 kilometers. It was a logistical nightmare for 11th century tech. This wasn't just a long trip. It was a broken lifeline. Everything the colonists might need more people: grain for planting, iron tools, and other supplies had to survive that voyage. Unlike later empires that could send whole fleets, the Greenlanders had a tiny population to draw from, estimated at only a few thousand people at its absolute peak. They just didn't have the bodies to spare to sustain a new settlement an ocean away, while also keeping their own fragile home going. A single lost ship wasn't a setback. It could be a catastrophe, wiping out a huge chunk of their able-bodied men or essential supplies. The Greenland colony itself wasn't entirely self-sufficient. While they could largely feed themselves, they relied on trade with Iceland and Norway for essentials like iron and timber. So, the Vinland settlement was a colony of a colony, a remote outpost clinging to another remote outpost. It was a bridge built one step too far. The sheer effort to sail to Vinland, cut down trees or trap animals for furs, and then haul it all back to Greenland, let alone to markets in Europe, was just enormous. The economic payoff probably wasn't worth the incredible cost and risk. They had found a land of plenty, but it was a world away from everything. A tiny island of Norse culture in a sea of hostility and isolation. The Vikings' entire westward push had been helped along by a stroke of climate luck. They set sail during the medieval warm period, a time from about 950 to 1250 AD, when temperatures in the North Atlantic were unusually mild. This made the voyages less dangerous, cut down on the sea ice blocking the routes, and made it possible to farm in the sheltered fjords of southwestern Greenland. Their arrival in Greenland and their discovery of America happened right in this favorable climate window. But climates don't stay still. Starting in the 14th century, the pendulum began to swing back. The North Atlantic cooled down, entering a period we now call the Little Ice Age. This wasn't a sudden deep freeze, but a gradual and devastating shift. For a society living on the absolute razor's edge of what was possible, gradual was more than enough to be a disaster. Temperatures dropped. Sea ice choked the shipping lanes for more of the year, making the already dangerous journey to Greenland nearly impossible. In Greenland itself, the growing seasons for hay, which was essential for feeding livestock through the long winters, got shorter and shorter. Recent studies suggest it wasn't just the cold. Severe summer droughts also made farming increasingly difficult. The archaeological evidence is clear. Over time, the Greenland Norse diet shifted, with less and less food coming from their farms and more from hunting seals. This climate shift essentially strangled the Greenland colony. It became harder to grow food, harder to hunt, and harder to trade with Europe. The western settlement was abandoned around 1350, and the larger eastern settlement held on until the early to mid-15th century, before it too vanished. The very lifeline that a Vinland colony would have depended on was withering away. The dream of American settlement wasn't just threatened by conflicts on the ground. It was being frozen out of existence. With Greenland gone, the bridge to America was broken for good. While facing threats from the outside, The small Viking community in Vinland was also rotting from within. The sagas, for all their heroics, are also brutally honest about the infighting that crippled the expeditions. These weren't unified teams with a single purpose. They were groups of ambitious, proud, and often greedy individuals. The sagas describe bitter fights over resources, leadership, and maybe most divisively, over the few women who joined the expeditions. The most infamous example, again, is Freydis Eriksdottir. On one trip, she allegedly tricked her husband into attacking and killing a rival group of Icelanders sharing their camp, all so she could steal their bigger ship and their share of the profits. When her men refused to kill the 5 women in the other group, Freydis supposedly grabbed an axe and did it herself. Whether the story is 100% true or just a good story, it points to a culture of intense rivalry, not the kind of social unity you need to build a new society in a hostile land. There's also a bigger question. Were the Vikings even trying to colonize North America? The evidence suggests probably not. It's more likely they saw Vinland as a giant resource depot. Greenland was desperately short on timber, a vital material for building ships and houses. Vinland, or more accurately Markland, was an endless source of wood. It was also rich in furs, which were like gold in Europe. The settlement at Launceau Meadows looks less like a town and more like a logging camp or a trading post. It seems they were there to harvest resources and go home. They weren't building for their grandchildren. They were trying to get rich. This lack of a long-term unified vision for a new society is completely different from the religious and imperial ambitions that drove later European settlement. The Vikings were raiders and traders. They were pragmatic. And when the Vinland business stopped being profitable, when the cost in blood and supplies outweighed the reward in timber and furs, they just stopped going. There was no grand finale for the Vikings in America. No last heroic stand or dramatic evacuation. The end was quiet. They just stopped coming back. The expeditions, worn down by violent conflict, logistical nightmares, and infighting, got less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. The American saga was over. The secret of their abandonment isn't that it was a conspiracy, but that it was so unimportant to the wider Viking world that it was almost immediately forgotten. The number of people who actually went to Vinland was tiny, maybe only a few hundred over a couple of decades. Back in Scandinavia, the focus was on Europe raiding England, serving as mercenaries in Byzantium, and building kingdoms at home. A failed business venture on the other side of the world, involving a handful of families from their most remote outpost, was barely a footnote. It didn't change their society or their future. The stories lived on, written down centuries later in the Icelandic sagas. But for most of the world, and even for many in Scandinavia, these tales became myths. The memory of Vinland became a ghost story, a half-remembered legend of a land of grapes and forests across the sea. It would take nearly 1,000 years, and the undeniable proof buried at Launceau Meadows, to prove the ghost was real. So, why did the Vikings abandon America? There's no one single reason. Their American dream died a death of 1,000 cuts. They were pushed back by a native population that rightly saw them as invaders. They were hamstrung by the impossible logistics of supporting a settlement from a tiny, failing colony thousands of miles away. Their efforts were frozen out by a changing climate that made the North Atlantic a death trap, and their home in Greenland unlivable. And they were undermined by their own infighting and their focus on short-term profits over a long-term future. The Vikings American saga wasn't a failure, but a brief, brilliant chapter that was simply not built to last. It's a powerful reminder that discovering a new world is one thing. Holding on to it is something else entirely. For 500 years after the last long ship sailed away, Vinland slipped back into legend, waiting to be discovered all over again. We can only wonder how history might be different if they had managed to stay. What kind of world would we live in today if the first American colonists had carried axes and shields instead of muskets and crosses? The questions are as tantalizing as the history itself. Let us know what you think in the comments below. And for more journeys into the mysteries of the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.